Hello and welcome back to Era 7 of the APUS History Curriculum. In this video, we will be looking at topic 7.4, the Progressives. The Progressivism movement is particularly important in transforming the U.S. government in terms of the types of domestic policies it pursued, and there's a lot to be addressed, so let's get to it. The single greatest factor that fueled the progressive movement in America was urbanization. For years, educated middle-class women had begun the work of reform in the nation's cities. The settlement house movement had sought to assist those who had no other options. The temperance movement sought to improve family life by eliminating the one thing that was often a factor in poverty, malnutrition, and violence within a family. And the social gospel movement had ministers preaching that good works were necessary for salvation, and those good works could benefit the poor. This progressive movement sought to use the government to improve human welfare and to fight monopolies, corruption, inefficiency, and social justice. In addition, you had an expansion of literacy, the print revolution increasing the number and types of books, magazines, and newspapers, and an increase in the number of writers delving into human interest stories. In particular, they sought to expose the darker side of city and industrial life. Thus, they became known as the muckrakers, for raking or exposing the muck of society to people's consciousness. Henry George attracted many followers by blaming inequalities in wealth on land ownership. In his 1879 work, Progress and Poverty, he suggested that profits made from land sales be taxed at a rate of 100%. Edward Bellamy peered into the future in his 1888 novel, Looking Backward, the hero of the story waking up in the year 2000 and looking back to see that all the hardships of the Gilded Age have withered away thanks to an activist, utopian socialist government. But perhaps one of the most influential was Jacob Riis. He was one of the earliest writers to focus on the problems of the city. At one time, he had lived in the slums of New York and other cities after emigrating to the U.S. His work, both his writing and his photographs, published as How the Other Half Lives in 1889, exposed the worst of the city's slums to a shocked public. Soon, other reformers were exposing other abuses of power and the poor. In 1902, Lincoln Steffens published an article in McClure's magazine called Tweed Days in St. Louis. He exposed how city officials worked in league with big business to maintain power while corrupting the public treasury. More and more articles followed, and soon he published the collection as a book entitled The Shame of the Cities. Around the same time, Ida Tarbell wrote The History of the Standard Oil Company, a devastating account of the ruthless practices of Rockefeller and his minions that helped lead to the breakup of the company in an antitrust lawsuit in 1911. But perhaps no muckraker caused as great a stir as Upton Sinclair. He hoped to illustrate the horrible effects of capitalism on workers in the Chicago meatpacking industry. His account of the Chicago stockyards and the lives of the people who worked there, in the jungle, detailed workers sacrificing their fingers and fingernails by working with acid, losing limbs, catching diseases, and toiling long hours in cold, cramped conditions. He hoped the public outcry would be so fierce that reforms would follow. Well, they did follow, but not what he had hoped for, because he had also uncovered the contents of the products being sold to the general public. Spoiled meat covered with chemicals to hide the smell, skin, hair, stomach, ears, and noses ground up and packaged as head cheese, rats climbing over warehouse meat, leaving piles of excrement behind. Sinclair once said that he had aimed for America's heart, and instead hit it squarely in the stomach. Even President Roosevelt, who coined the derisive term muckraker, was propelled to act, and within months, Congress passed the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act to curb these abuses. Progressivism was really not a tightly organized political movement. Rather, it was a collection of different ideas and activities seeking to fix the problems they believed existed in American society. They shared a common belief that industrialization and urbanization had created these social and political problems. So who were the people who were involved in this movement? The progressives tended to be urban, from the Northeast, educated, middle class or upper class, and Protestant, reform-minded men and women. There was no official political party called the Progressives, at least not until 1912, but progressivism was more of a movement than a political party anyway, and there were adherents to the philosophy in each of the major parties. And there would be three progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt and Taft were Republican, and Wilson was a Democrat. What united the movement was a belief that the laissez-faire social Darwinist outlook of the Gilded Age was morally and intellectually wrong. Progressives believed that the people and the government had the power to correct abuses produced by nature and the free market. With such varied groups adhering to the philosophy, it's hard to believe that they had any sort of common goals, but generally they did. There were four main goals of the progressive movement: protecting social welfare, which means tackling the problems brought by industrialization, including providing government assistance for those in need; promoting moral improvement by targeting poverty, alcohol, and abuse with the goal of making changes in people's character; creating economic reform, which sought regulation of the economy by having the government change its policies toward business; and fostering efficiency by developing better business and government practices that would hopefully lead to less corruption and especially develop a more effective use of resources. In general, these worked to make American society a better and safer place in which to live. They tried to make big business more responsible through regulations of various kinds, and worked to clean up corrupt city governments, to improve working conditions in factories, and to better living conditions for those who lived in slum areas, a large number of whom were recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many progressives were also concerned with the environment and the conservation of natural resources. This generation of Americans also hoped to make the world a more democratic place. At home, this meant expanding the right to vote to women and a number of election reforms like the recall, the referendum, and the direct election of senators. And abroad, this meant trying to make the world safe for democracy. Within the progressive movement, there was some disagreement about key issues. In particular, some were disappointed by the lack of concern for the situation of African Americans in the U.S. Wilson, the first Southerner elected to the presidency since the Civil War, especially had no interest in addressing the issues of racial discrimination and violence faced by African Americans because he viewed them as inferior, a commonly held belief amongst many white Americans at the time. The same held true for Native Americans, though Wilson did praise many tribes and individuals for their adherence to the government's assimilation policy, but he still continued to open up unallotted Indian land to white settlers and to modify the boundaries of reservations as he saw fit. Women's suffrage was another issue where progressives disagreed. Some felt that this was going too far, as it would upset the traditional gender norms. Others felt that there was no reason to deny women the vote. President Wilson, responding to reports of mistreatment of women who had been arrested at various protests, wholeheartedly supported the movement, especially recognizing women's contribution to the war efforts, saying, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" And the debate also continued to rage over what to do about the massive amounts of immigration, especially as war in Europe threatened to bring even more people who were fleeing from that conflict. Some saw immigrants as cheap labor, others as competition for jobs. At the national level, the populist ideas of an income tax and direct election of senators became the 16th and 17th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution under progressive direction. Continuing to expand the electorate, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. This was also a national level goal. Even the long-standing temperance movement saw a resurgence during the progressive era and resulted in the passage of the 18th Amendment, although the needs of soldiers and allies in World War I were necessary to finally secure passage of those last two. In order to challenge the influence of political bosses, like, for example, Tammany Hall, progressives sought to make use of the secret ballot. One of the reasons political bosses had been able to keep power in the first place is that they could dole out favors to members of the community in exchange for votes, which were done in plain sight. A secret ballot would significantly reduce the power of the urban political machines. Other political reforms, some left over from the populist movement, also were enacted in the progressive era. Most of these reforms, though, were at the state level. Under the governorship of Robert La Follette, Wisconsin became a laboratory for many of these political reforms. The first law involved the creation of the direct primary. Prior to this time, the only people who had a hand in selecting candidates for elections were delegates at conventions. Direct primaries allowed party members to vote directly for a candidate, with the nomination going to the one with the most votes. This was the beginning of the current system of holding a primary election before a general election. Another series of reforms pushed by progressives sought to sidestep the power of special interests in state legislature and restore the democratic political process were three election innovations: the initiative, referendum, and recall. The first permitted voters to enact legislation by petitioning to place an idea or an initiative on the ballot. The second innovation allowed voters to counteract laws passed by the legislature by holding a referendum. That means putting an existing law on the ballot for voters to either affirm or to reject. Currently, 24 states allow some form of initiative and referendum. The third element of this direct democracy agenda was the recall. The recall permitted citizens to remove a public official from office through a process of petition and vote, similar to the initiative and referendum. Now let's look a little more closely at the national level progressive reform, and let's highlight some of the key policies of the three progressive presidents. Theodore Roosevelt came to the presidency because of the assassination of William McKinley. He had graduated with the highest honors from Harvard, had authored 23 books, and was considered one of the world's foremost authorities on Native American wildlife. He was a prize-fighting championship finalist, leader of the Rough Riders from the Spanish-American War, a cowboy, a socialite, a police commissioner, a governor, and then vice president, and he was just 42 years old. In terms of his progressive policies, Roosevelt promised the average citizen fairness, breaking of trusts, the regulation of railroads, and pure food and drugs. He called this his square deal, and it reflected three basic goals: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. These three demands are often referred to as the 3 C's of Roosevelt's square deal. Thus, it aimed at helping middle-class citizens and involved attacking the plutocracy and bad trusts, while at the same time protecting business from the most extreme demands of organized labor. In 1902, Pennsylvania coal miners went on strike, seeking better wages, shorter hours, and the recognition of their union. The mine owners refused to negotiate and shut down the mines. Attempts to appeal to them, even by J.P. Morgan, did not result in any talks. As the strike reached into fall, Roosevelt decided to intervene, not knowing how the public would react if it continued into winter. No president had ever tried to negotiate a strike settlement before. So Roosevelt invited representatives of each side to the White House, though the owners resented the summons by the president to meet what they called a common criminal and refused any sort of concessions. So he ordered his Secretary of War to prepare the army to seize the mines in order to make coal available to the public. He didn't seem to mind that he had no constitutional authority to do any such thing. But within days, the strike ended. Workers across America cheered Roosevelt for standing up to the mine owners. It surely seemed like the White House would lend a helping hand to the labor movement. Roosevelt was also concerned that there seemed to be no limit to corporate greed. The president's weapon against big business was the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed by Congress in 1890. This law had declared illegal all combinations and restraint of trade, and for the first 12 years of its existence, it really wasn't very effective. U.S. courts usually sided with business when any enforcement of the act was attempted. But that changed under Roosevelt, and the first trust giant to fall victim to his attack was none other than the most powerful industrialist in the country, J.P. Morgan. He controlled a railroad company known as Northern Securities, which controlled the bulk of railroad shipping across the northern United States. Morgan was actually shocked that Roosevelt would target him and not even give him the courtesy of advance notice. But Roosevelt felt that Morgan ran a bad trust and would target those who took advantage of the people. And this was actually the core of his leadership. Roosevelt boiled everything down to a case of right versus wrong and good versus bad. If a trust controlled an entire industry but provided good service at reasonable rates, then it was a good trust and would be left alone. Only the bad trusts that jacked up rates and exploited consumers would come under attack. And of course the public cheered this new offensive, and the Supreme Court, in a narrow decision, agreed and dissolved the Northern Securities Company. Roosevelt said confidently that no man, no matter how powerful, was above the law. For consumers, the biggest laws passed had been the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Meat Inspection Act set up a federal grading system and an inspection process for all domestic and international meat products, focusing primarily on the handling of the meat at the slaughterhouses. The Pure Food and Drug Act required the listing of all ingredients inside of a product, both inspired by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. In addition, Roosevelt was concerned with conservation of America's natural resources, but we'll look a little more closely at that one in a minute. Taft continued Roosevelt's progressive policies and even broke twice as many trusts in his one term as president as Roosevelt had broken in his almost 2 terms. Taft limited the workday of federal employees to 8 hours and supported the 16th Amendment, which empowered Congress to levy a federal income tax. He also created a Children's Bureau and supported the 17th Amendment, which allowed for senators to be directly elected by the people instead of state legislatures. But he did break with those same policies by signing into law the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which actually raised the overall tariff rate, and by firing the nation's chief forester and Roosevelt's personal friend, Gifford Pinchot, backtracking on Roosevelt's conservation policies. By 1912, progressives within the Republican Party encouraged Roosevelt to challenge Taft for the party's nomination. He was unsuccessful in doing so and instead headed up the new Progressive Party, bringing much Republican support with him. Also running that year was the progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson, as well as socialist Eugene V. Debs. Progressivism was at its peak. But because of the split vote within the Republican Party, Wilson was able to claim a sweeping victory and institute his own brand of progressivism. His plan was simple: regulate the banks and big businesses and lower the tariff rates to increase international trade, increasing competition in the interests of consumers. He sought to achieve this vision by attacking what Wilson called the triple wall of privilege: the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. He signed the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, which lowered tariff rates across the board, eliminating it on some products. And to offset the potential loss of federal revenue, he's the one that actually passed the federal income tax, which had recently been authorized by the 16th Amendment. To tackle the banking system, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act to regulate the banking industry, as well as establish a federal banking system, creating 12 regional reserve banks regulated by a presidentially appointed Federal Reserve Board. The board, known informally as the Fed, regulated the interest rate at which reserve banks loaned out or distributed money to other banks across the country. Thus, when economic times were challenging, like in a recession, the Fed could lower this rate to encourage more borrowing, which put more currency in circulation for people to spend or invest. Conversely, the Fed could stop inflationary trends with interest hikes that discouraged borrowing. This system is actually still the basis for the country's modern banking model. Then Wilson completed his agenda with the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act. Unlike Roosevelt, he did not distinguish between good trusts and bad trusts. Any trust, by virtue of its large size, was bad in Wilson's eyes. This law expanded the power of the original Sherman Antitrust Act in order to allow the investigation and dismantling of more monopolies. It also took on the practice of interlocking directorates, competing companies that still actually operated together in sort of a form of a conspiracy to restrain trade. This same act also exempted labor unions from antitrust suits, declared strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing perfectly legal. Returning to the issue of conservation, in the mid to late 19th century, natural resources had been heavily exploited, especially in the West. Assuming a seemingly inexhaustible supply of natural resources, Americans had developed a tradition of waste. Alarmed by the public's attitude towards natural resources, as well as the exploitation of natural resources for private gain, conservationists called for federal supervision of these resources and the preservation of those resources for future generations. And Roosevelt in particular agreed. He was influenced by many of America's greatest naturalists, like John Muir, as well as his own political appointees, including Gifford Pinchot, Chief of Forestry. The president called for a far-reaching integrated program of conservation, reclamation, and irrigation. And by the time Teddy Roosevelt left office, more than 150 million acres of land had been deemed natural forests, safe from the axe and the saw of the timber industry. This amounted to 3 times the total protected lands since the original law had been enacted. He also added 50 wildlife refuges, 5 new national parks, and initiated the system of designating national monuments, such as Devil's Tower National Monument. Well, that about covers what you need to know about the progressives for topic 7.4. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.